Hi guys, and welcome to the first video for 2019. And I'm going to introduce you to the first topic that we're going to cover in 2019, and that's called minds and bodies. And that is mainly about a thing we call dualism, where we look at whether or not the mind is part of the body or is it something separate altogether. And do we have a different name for mind? And we'll go through and we'll have a look at different explanations that have been provided by different philosophers. And the first philosopher we're going to look at is Rene Descartes. Do not pronounce it Descartes. It is Descartes. And today we're going to familiarize ourselves with the historical context of Descartes. And then we're going to introduce ourselves to the most basic ideas, or to the basics of Descartes' methodological / radical doubt. Our success criteria today, could you write these down, because we probably will refer to them in class when we discuss things a bit more, is we're going to explore Descartes' historical context, then we're going to name and define what we call Cartesian or methodological or radical doubt. Then we're going to explore arguments that, not the, but that undermine the certainty of what we call sense data. Now, I'm going to have to say that because this is our introduction to Descartes, we probably don't know what the hell we're talking about. So write them down, and I give yourself out of 4 a score that's around about 0 to 1, and we'll see how you go at the end of the video and some applied activities. Alrighty, so just quickly score yourself on these success criteria, and then I want you to have a look at this picture and write down how it makes you feel. Because this idea of flat Earth versus round Earth is kind of analogous to what's going on in Descartes' time. Can you do that for me? That'd be great. Okay, so let's look at the historical context of Descartes. Now, before the 16th century, science was kind of stuck. In fact, most of our thinking and our thoughts revolved around Aristotle and what the Catholic Church said was true, and how the Catholic Church interpreted Aristotle. Okay? And if you did what they said, because if you didn't do what they say, you'd be in trouble. This understanding of Aristotle was also interpreted in light of the Bible. So it's the Bible and Aristotle combined and interpreted by the Catholic Church, which determined what was true. If I were you, I'd probably take a note, and do not write it down verbatim. I'll be very angry. But the thing was, this guy called Descartes was starting to think, hang on, maybe, just maybe, there are other kinds of truths. You see, he was existing in a time where science was starting to take off. In fact, he would have been somebody who wanted to question what the church was saying, but in order to save the church, that is. He wasn't against the church. He just wanted to have a look at where science was going and what science was thinking in order to think about, well, what is truth and how can we move there? And the reason why I've got this picture of a revolution was because he existed in a time of what we call a scientific revolution, and that's what these 3 pictures represent. And in that scientific revolution, progress was being made, a lot of progress. And progress that was dealing with science by itself in its kind of empirical form, but also in the way that we thought about logic. Maybe you should take a note. You see, at that time, Galileo was staring into his telescope, and he'd found existence of moons, not just around our moon, but of course, moons around all the external planets. And this really, really questioned the dogma of the church, and put him pretty much on a ledge. It was very dangerous for him. And Descartes was going, oh, gee, this is interesting. How do we kind of think about our existence and who we are in light of the fact that things that we were told by the church are not necessarily true? In fact, the truth they provide is kind of making us hang on a bit of a ledge. We can't just trust the Bible and the interpretation of it, using, of course, Aristotle. Take a note. So during his time, Rene Descartes was thought of as one of the best philosophers, especially one of the best philosophers of science, which is strange because some of his theories haven't really come to pass. So he developed a really well-known theory about matter and its different phases, which rejected this Newtonian idea of particles. In fact, he thought that matter was more of a substance and it couldn't be divided into particles like Newton had conceived. All right, and he also fought very hard against what he called was scholasticism. Like, he believed in the church, but he didn't believe that you dogmatically accepted the church's teaching of Aristotle and the other doctrines that not necessarily followed through the interpretation of the Bible. Truth, he thought, was there to be found in, which basically taught that truth is found in nature. And, here you have a look at the kind of universe and nature together. And they were teaching the fact that you just reflected on it. And they thought, well, obviously, here's Aristotle's version of how the universe worked. It was a theory of concentric rings going around and around the earth. And the Catholic Church believed this. They also believed that nature and the universe was made up of 4 elements: fire, wind, earth, water. We've heard that all before. And he was kind of against this kind of scholasticism, this traditional interpretation made through Aristotle and through the religious texts. He wanted to question it. And this brought on a very important period in philosophy, which we call the Enlightenment. Can you take a note? So Descartes was a man who wanted to sit down and reflect on what he thought were rational principles. And that literally means the opposite of empirical principles. He wanted to arrive through a method at something that he could be completely certain of. And he did this through what he calls his meditations. Right? And here, in his meditations on philosophy, he kind of says, well, look, this idea of man and the universe being created in perfect harmony, well, it's kind of reflected in the religious text. But what I want to be able to see is I want to see a harmony between the sciences, and I want to see a harmony between the the church. I want them to coexist together, so that ultimately we could move to a third way of thinking about the world, which we're going to call the Enlightenment. Okay, take a note. So the Enlightenment was literally a movement away from what we call scholasticism, where both the sciences and religion could exist together. And this kind of really, really was important for him, because it was a way for him to kind of judge and evaluate theories of God. And that's really what he wanted to prove, right? He wanted to be able to see the harmony between religion and theology and science, and see how the two could combine together to create the ultimate argument for the existence of God, and one that was a very rational and enlightened view of the existence of God. Take a note. So in his preface, though, he kind of gets onto his methodology a bit more. He gets a bit deeper. And here he says as follows, okay? His aim is to find the foundations. He is a rationalist, which means he believes in what we call a priori foundations. And a priori, if you remember, priori means prior to. Well, it kind of means like the thoughts that come before, the things that come before the observation, or prior usually means after, doesn't it? It's really confusing, but I like to think of it as prior or kind of primary, the first, the kind of thinking principles, or the assumed ideas, you know what I mean? And so that's the way I like to think of it. And he basically looked at this rationalist method, and he assumed that if he thought and used kind of rationalist thinking, which was basically analyzing ideas and rejecting sense data and anything empirical, and he had a method to analyze these things, then he would be able to progress really, really far and fly into science and find a scientific truth about our existence. And we call this strategy Cartesian skepticism. Take a note. You see, Cartesian skepticism is the same thing as methodological doubt, and it's the same thing as radical doubt. And basically, it is that you doubt every possible belief that you can have until you find one absolutely certain thing, something that cannot be doubted at all. And this starts off with a rejection of sense data and moves towards an evaluation of our rational conclusions or logical conclusions or a priori truths, okay? He is a rationalist and he wants to find that one core belief that can never be doubted, and he wants to build a philosophy on top of that, okay? So paragraphs 1 and 2 kind of outline this principle of building a rational foundation for the rest of his philosophy, okay? Which is why I'm saying a rationalization of many beliefs. And it kind of gets us to think about sense data and how important it is, because he believes that sense data can be easily undermined. It can be fooled. And here's an example of how that's the case, all right? I mean, you see a guy holding a mop and umbrella, the big nose, and your assumption is, well, you can see what he's assuming. But obviously, that's not the fact. You know, optical illusions and other things prove that the sense data can be easily undermined. It can be easily tricked. And because they're easily deceived, well, that's our first place of doubt. We doubt what we observe. We doubt our empiricism. So take some notes. Now, remember, it's never enough, ever, to be able to just assume that a summary is enough. You need to be able to read a text and find the deeper kind of logic or exposition he has of his argument. And we're going to do that right now. We're going to read the text and maybe think about any kind of extra insights we may get as we get a more detailed description of what he's talking about. So it's important to add extra notes in this section, and also remember that the study design requires us to read texts. Another thing I want to say is that a lot of philosophy teachers just send you home to read the text separately and then discuss them at home. I would prefer to give you an interactive video that reads the text to you, so that way you have someone explaining what you are reading and it doesn't seem that confusing. Okay, so let's go through the first two paragraphs. I must also tell you that the first two paragraphs are in keeping with the section outlined in the textbook. So everything that we read right now corresponds directly to textbook, and always these paragraph sections that I'm talking about will always correspond with the paragraphs outlined in the textbook, so we can match the two up, because some people prefer that. Okay, let's go. Some years ago, I was struck by the large number of falsehoods that I accepted as true in my childhood, and by the highly doubtful nature of the whole edifice, that means structure, that I had subsequently based on them. So he's saying, I had these assumptions or these falsehoods, and then I built a whole way of understanding the world on them. I realized that it was necessary once in the course of my life to demolish everything completely and start right from the foundations if I wanted to establish anything at all in the sciences that was stable and likely to last. But the task looked an enormous one, and I began to wait until I should reach a mature enough age to ensure that no subsequent time of life would be more suitable for tackling such inquiries. This led me to put the project off for so long that I would now be to blame if by this led me to put the project off for so long that I would now be to blame if by pondering over it any further I wasted the time still left for carrying it out. So he's saying, okay, I had this idea for a project when I was young. Now, when I think about it, it was too big. I wanted to wait till it's mature, but if I keep putting off, it's never going to happen, so I'm going to do it. And the project is to find the foundations for understanding the world, okay? So he goes, so today I have expressly rid my mind of all worries and arranged for myself a clear stretch of free time. I am here quite alone, and at last I will devote myself sincerely and without reservation to the general demolition of my opinions. But to accomplish this, it will not be necessary for me to show that all my opinions are false, which is something I could perhaps never manage. Reasons now lead me to think that I should hold back my assent from opinions which are not completely certain and indubitable, which means undoubtable, just as carefully as I do from those which are patently false. So what he's going to say is, I'm not going to try and outline every false opinion I have. I'm just going to try and explore things that could be true, but they're not certain, or something that is patently false. I'm going to dismiss both of them, okay? So, for the purpose of rejecting all my opinions, it will be enough that I find each of them at least some reason for doubt. So what he's saying is, I'll reject everything that is patently false, and I'll reject anything that can be doubted, because it could be wrong. And to do this, I will not need to run through them all individually, which would be an endless task. Once the foundations of a building are undermined, anything built on them collapses of its own accord. So I'll go straight to the basic principles on which all my former beliefs have rested. What he's basically saying is, instead of undermining all of my held beliefs that can be uncertain, I'll go to the ones that underpin all the other beliefs, the foundation ones, and I'm going to see if they can be held indubitably or if they can be doubted. So I'm just going to explore core beliefs, and if they collapse, then everything on top of them collapses. Take some notes. Okay, so in this video, we've done quite a fair bit. We have outlined the historical context, and we have named and defined what we call Cartesian skepticism, which is the same thing as methodological doubt and radical doubt. Remember, this is basically the assumption that you explore everything you know and examine all core beliefs until you find the one core belief that cannot be doubted at all. And then we explore arguments that undermine the certainty of our sense data. So he's basically saying, look, you know, sometimes this stuff that I'm thinking about, it's kind of wrong. All right. And the reason why I got you to draw the APK, if you think about it, is he was moving from this kind of flat earth assumption, the simplistic understanding, to try and understand how the world was scientifically. And science tells us the earth is round. But, you know, previously, a lot of people may have thought in a way which was akin to saying the earth is flat. So this is a great analogy for the period that he was going through. Alrighty, we're going to talk about this in class as well. That's really important. So make sure you've taken all your notes, and I'm going to put up something that's very important. It's a thinking activity. It is important. It's part of your coursework to make sure you do the thinking activity I've listed here as well. Cheers.